is Jan Down. Is that better? All right. I still am Jan Down. So, anyway, thank you for being here. I'm here because of a whole lot of people. First of all, my husband, Jim, who has been with me every step and pedal stroke of the way, and has tried, you can't hear.
Move this up.
Move it up? Mm-hmm. Or do I hold it?
No, I think we can move it up. Maybe that'll help. See if that helps.
Okay? Is that better? Okay. And if a little tiny bit better, some of you may have to just move forward. I don't know. Anyway, I am here because of a lot of people and a lot of miles spent on bicycles. First of all, my husband Jim has been with me every pedal stroke and step of the way and has tried to check to see if everything I said in the book is true. You be the judge. There are several other people here who also were on a lot of the trips, and that's Sandy Schultz and Retha, and of course Retha's husband Ray, and then Dave. Now somebody has asked, is there anything about Dave in the book? Well, yes, since he rode so many miles with us. Actually, he's the only person who has an entire chapter devoted to him. Ice Cube Press publisher, Steve Semkin, has guided me, because I'm a total novice, as you probably know, about how a book comes to be. And then my patient and persistent friend and editor, Jan Abramowitz, reader friends, Sandy Schultz, Ethel Barker, who is here somewhere, Retha and Ray Haas, Retha back there, Dan Knighty, right there, who many of you will know as the founder of World of Bikes in Iowa City, Mary Humston, right over there, and then Susie Branch, who could not make it here from Florida. Plus all the University Club Writers Group, who have encouraged and prodded me to keep at it. Plus our friends and family who listened and then pleaded, please finish the book, maybe so they'd get some peace and quiet. Thank you also to Oak Knoll for providing opportunities for me and other writers and artists to share our work. The title of my book, Wind in My Wheels, was suggested by someone many of you knew and remember and love, Lois Meal. She said, Jan, you should call your book Wind in My Wheels. I experimented with other titles, but Lois's voice kept whispering in my ear, wind in my wheels, wind in my wheels, and so it is. Although Jim and I started seriously riding our bicycles in 1978, it was many years later, after hearing some of our stories, friends began saying, you should write a book. It took many more years to actually do it. We kept taking long-distance rides. We worked both locally and internationally with Habitat for Humanity and traveled, all of which I would do again in a heartbeat. Finally, I settled in to commit to finishing the book that I had started in my brain, in journals, and in stories we've told. I will read 2 passages from it, and then there will be time for questions and answers, and after that I'll be signing books for anyone who might want to. This is the first message to the reader. Once upon a time, someone told a little farm girl something that puzzled her. You're just like your dad and brother. You were born under a wandering star. She wondered what that meant, but just smiled and didn't ask. She thought and finally realized she was a dreamer. She liked to sit in a tree and read and think about what could happen in the future. And she always wanted to see what was on the other side of the next hill. When her parents gave her and her brother shiny new bicycles, she stood at the top of the lane, straddling hers, looking at the hill in front of her. She had no idea or way of knowing what vistas would open for her, nor did she dream that two wheels would take her places she could never have imagined. Decades later, as I thought of that little girl, me, I recalled my physical, spiritual, mental, and psychological quests during that incredible interlude. Reflecting on that time, I envisioned a crazy quilt, a montage of poignant, joy-filled, laughter-laced stories gleaned from bicycling travels across the 50 United States with my husband. Anecdotes multiplied from the simple pleasures of lovely biking weather, quiet roads, camaraderie of family and good friends, doing what we loved together. Other adventures birthed a myriad of even more complex tales. I love remembering the wonderful paths of my life that emerged on this pilgrimage, and how writing about them created its own journey. My hope is that the accounts bring the reader pleasure, revelation of some of the delights and woes of long-distance cycling, and insight into the dreams of a long-ago little girl who wanted to see what was on the other side of the next hill. Now I'll read a short passage from our ride across Virginia in 1989. I chose it because it shares several things common to many of our rides: historic places to visit, weather challenges, route changes, on-the-road problems, and lack of time to do everything we wanted to. This is Virginia. Give us a sign. The riders were Betty Oglesby, Jim, and I. Our canary yellow rain suits contrasted brightly with the facade of the Lincoln Memorial on a pearl gray March day. We three riders eagerly posed for the start of the bike trip photos taken by our loyal van drivers, our middle daughter Tanya, and Darcy, her best friend. They planned to explore museums and historic spots in Washington, D.C., before wandering south to Williamsburg and Virginia Beach to meet us in Franklin, Virginia, the terminus of our spring break ride. We had already paid our respects to Mr. Jefferson, felt solemn in the presence of Mr. Lincoln, and thrilled to start this trip in such an auspicious location. But as we often quote on bicycle trips, with apologies to Robert Frost, we had miles to go before we could sleep. Although bleak and bare trees did not reflect our optimistic anticipation of clearing skies, we headed for the Mount Vernon Bicycle Trail. This wide path, with long, picturesque wooden bridges, led from Arlington to Mount Vernon. To our chagrin, rain soon pounded us. Despite our early morning breakfast, hunger pangs set in. We spotted a restaurant near the trail, and I stopped, ready to enter. Jim and Betty looked at our dripping selves and deemed the restaurant too fancy for us in our condition. I convinced them, since there seemed to be no other options, we should go in anyway. If the management didn't want to serve us, they would tell us, and no ominous sign reminded potential patrons we reserved the right to refuse service to anyone. Obviously, they had not anticipated serving people in what has been called our drowned rat condition. With feet slopping in soaked shoes, we shook ourselves off and went in. The hostess greeted us pleasantly, even as we created puddles. A warming meal and beginning to be not quite so wet clothes humored us. A curious fellow diner approached and asked us, "Do you belong to a bowling team?" After our initial startled reaction, we realized she thought our rain gear comprised uniforms. We assured her we were not a bowling team. Another person queried, "Firefighters?" Did we disappoint them by saying no? A light mist accompanied us as we arrived at elegant Mount Vernon. Unfortunately, we had started later than anticipated, so we couldn't spend much time there. We still felt the history of the place and relished the fact of being there on our bicycles. Traversing hilly, wooded rural Virginia inspired us to stop to admire the beauty, but we couldn't linger, ever mindful that dusk comes early in mid-March. We had to arrive by 5 at the Fredericksburg B&B, where Jim had arranged an overnight. Expert route maker and chief navigator Jim generally used the reliable Bicentennial and East Coast Bikeway maps to plan our route. About 3:30, he, who also has an excellent sense of direction, stopped at an intersection. He pulled over to the side of the road, looked around in consternation. "This just doesn't seem right. I think we should go straight, but the maps say we should turn left." As drivers paused at the stop sign, we asked them, "Which way is Route 27? None of them had a clue. The intermittent rain turned to snow, and our concerns grew about being stranded in the middle of unknown territory at nightfall. After another moment of hesitation, Jim decided, "All right, let's follow the map." We turned left and rode 20 yards. He stopped at a bridge and shook his head. "This still doesn't feel right." The light began to fade. In desperation, I raised my arms, and pleaded, "Okay, God, give us a sign." Before we could take another breath, Jim's back tire went sssss. Betty and I glanced at each other, stifled giggles, and all 3 of us returned to the stop sign, a better spot to change a tire. With Betty's and my expert assistance, Jim changed the tube, replaced the wheel, spun to make sure the brakes worked, put the panniers on, smiled slightly, looked up and said firmly, "Okay, God, the next time my wife asks for a sign, give it to her." I noticed that I had neglected saying a couple of other people who had ridden on bike rides with us as we were biking across the country. Sue and Lee and Mary Palmberg. We joined her group as she was biking across the whole country. And so we had a day of overlap. So there are other bikers in this group that had part of this book. Now I'm asking if any of you have questions or comments. And we have a microphone if anybody has anything to ask.
How many trips did it actually take?
I don't know. Jim, do you know? How many trips did this actually take us?
I mean, there's 50 states, but it was more than 50 trips, right?
Yes. Well, no, because sometimes we bicycled across several states at a time. Actually, there are about 50, though some of the times we had to, like for California, we took 2 trips and so forth, but that was something I never counted up. If you buy the book, you can count them. Otherwise, I'll count it for you. Yes, Lou.
Could you describe the process that you went through in writing the book? I was wondering if you could describe the process of writing your book. Did you try to write something most every day? Did you have notes that you were taking? What was your procedure for working at this book all this time?
I didn't follow rules very well. I know that writers say, real writers say, write every single day. Well, there were some days I didn't. I took journals on some of these rides. I had no idea at the very beginning that I would even think of a book. And so when I wrote journals, that was really helpful. And sometimes I took journals along, and I was too tired at the end of the day, and I ended up with a pen in my hand and a journal on my face, and because I'd fallen asleep. So it was not a wonderfully steady stream of words that came. Once I committed to it, I was much better about it. But periodically, I'd send a story to our family, and we'd tell stories to our friends. And then I was thinking seriously about it, and I joined the University Club Writers Group. And that was a turning point for me, because people started saying, you're doing okay, let's keep this up, keep writing. And they were wonderfully kind. Ruthlessly kind is the motto. And I remember one time I came in and I said, I am so dissatisfied with this chapter, it's awful, I need help. And I read it to them and they said, that's the worst thing you've ever written. I thought, okay. And I agreed totally, because it was, and I had rewritten it and it just had no form. So it was a slow and steady and up and down process, Lou. It was not according to the book, other people's books. And finally, Shirley Wyrick said to me, she wrote me a note and she said, make the book. And so that was another trigger, and just help from all of the people who were there, several of whom are sitting right here. That's not a very good answer. I would love to say, oh, well, I was just so disciplined, but I can't. Yes, Pete?
Jan, I remember talking to Jim after one particularly arduous trip. I think it was Kansas. But what was the hardest state that you crossed as far as hard work and adverse whatever?
One of the most, well, there were so many that were beautiful, but one that was just so arduous that sticks out in my mind was South Dakota. And it started out, we had wind at our backs, and then we had wind from this is one day, our wind from our side, and then it was a quarter wind, and then it was a headwind, and every direction we were turning, it was turning out to be a quarter wind or a headwind. And then later on in that trip, I wanted to sell my bike and buy a car. and I got up in the middle of the night after one day when it was so awful, and I said, Jim, this isn't fun anymore. and it wasn't. And that was the day before we were approaching a tornado. But I had decided that we were going to rent a car, and there wasn't a rental car within 75 miles of this town. And so I thought, rent a wreck, buy a wreck. And so I went back to bed, and I was perfectly content, and I said, the next morning I said, Jim, I've decided what we should do. And I told him I wanted to buy a car for a day, and that we could, start our lives over again. And he said, "Oh, honey, don't make any rash decisions on an empty stomach." And I thought, oh, he's right. I didn't want to stop that trip. So I think, Pete, that was the one that I remember the most as being really, really hard. Yes.
Did you take one trip every year and then
Or what was your schedule for taking trips?
Some years we took only one trip, but a lot of them we tried to get a spring break trip where we would bike in a place that was usually warmer than Iowa City in mid-March. And so several times, 2001, we had several long trips that were really wonderful, but it was not consistent. And sometimes we would bike in a foreign country, which often meant that we would not be biking in the United States. So we were inconsistent, but just about every year, except I think 1 or 2, we had at least one bike trip for 26 years. Okay, other questions?
Can you describe some of the close calls you might have had on the road, like with either accidents with the bicycles or with cars, their traffic and that kind of thing, or just even with worse weather than what you've described?
Yes. There was one that was horrendous that Sandy and I remember extraordinarily well because of our beloved husbands. And they had made a decision that we did not agree with, but we were not strong enough to say, we're not going to go out and bike in that. So, and we were biking east in Arizona and into New Mexico. And we stopped at the one place we could stop all day. And people came in and said, did you see that accident? There were some people killed in a dust storm right behind us, which we did not know. We had trucks pass very close to us, clip our youngest daughter on her elbow. We had things thrown at us. This was mostly early in our biking careers. And then one that personally, was traumatic on many levels is our youngest daughter and son-in-law had died, and this was one of the first trips afterwards. And when I rode by myself, I would become a little melancholy and I would think about them, and I wasn't paying attention like I needed to be on a highway. And I was thinking about Jennifer and Bernd. And Dave, fortunately, was riding behind me. And he yelled, "Jan!" And that got me out. And I looked ahead, and there was a semi-truck passing another semi-truck. And he was in the second lane of our 2-lane highway. And so I just had enough energy and emotion to be able to pull off. And so Dave saved my life in that particular instance. And so there were close calls, but generally we came through and we felt very blessed. And we gave thanks every day that we came through safely, because it can be, as you all know, can be a dangerous time. Fortunately, we all loved it.
This is a combination of a funny story for you and also a writing process. I don't think I'll forget coming over to your house once when you said, we just had a conversation and it's like part of the book's not true. Or maybe it was Jim said, that's just not true. And so I just think that's funny, but then I started thinking about it. I thought a lot of times people worry about whether the thing is true or not, but I was wondering if that's sort of how you dealt with the memories that you decided to tell. And whether, were you influenced by anyone, or how did you balance that?
Yes. Well, there were times when I tell a story and Jim would read and say, that isn't the way it happened. And I said, it's the way that happened to me. And so he got to the point where he said, this is your story. write it your way. Now, there were times when I heard a little grumbling in the background, but we always came over and said, if Sandy and Dave had ridden with us, Sandy and I had amazingly had similar experiences, and the guys had different experiences. And then when Retha and Ray were with us, you know, we had another couple of people to talk about, how did you experience this? And it really is the way you maybe are being that emotional, or just you're feeling really strong that day and it wasn't a tough day and I just thought it was terrific. And other times it would be hard for somebody and I'd kind of look around and say, I'm not getting that strong, but it just happened to be a really, really good day. And Dan is nodding his head. He knows about those things on long distance trips too. So yes, and it ended up being that generally speaking, this is my story, and Jim has not yet given his total stamp of approval, but we're hoping that someday that will come. But he has been so supportive in other ways, despite the way I believe I remember things, right? Yes, Jim?
I was wondering, how many bikes did you go through? And like, what kind of mileage do you think you've logged in all those? I mean, you know, I kind of kept track. I did 10 rag rides and I kind of kept track. And then it was like, well, it really didn't matter. You know, you should ride because you love it and you don't care that it's this many. So many bikes did you go through from 78 to, and when was your last, when did you do your last state?
Yeah, the last long distance ride was 2011. And I have another bike since then. But we went through, I think, 4 apiece, and a lot of water bottles and sets of panniers and shoes and shorts and shirts, and how many tubes of sunscreen and all of those things. And the mileage, probably on the trip itself, was about 25,000, 20 to 25,000. Is that about right, Jim? And then of course, all the training that you do. And so we were not really good keepers of scores. Dave was. He loved the numbers, and so he knew about what he had ridden. And some of us would just kind of, oh yeah, it was about. On a long day though, I made sure I knew exactly what Jim's odometer said, because he declared that odometer was the official one. And so no matter what mine said, if mine had more mileage, that was my official one. So does that kind of answer your question, Jim?
In general, how many miles a day did you do?
Generally, it was between 50 and 80, but our longest day was 132 miles. And we rode short distances when we were in Europe. But somehow or another in the United States, that open road just called our names in different ways. So, but generally it was between 50 and 80. Marilyn?
Did you ever have a hat blow off or something fall down and something you couldn't retrieve? Did you ever lose personal things?
No, about the only time things fell off was when you'd be climbing a hill and a mosquito or a fly would start circling because you smell so good. And I'd swat at it and I'd hit my rearview mirror on this side. And that meant getting off your bicycle and stomping over and picking it up and getting it back on and trying to get going on the hill again. Those are the kinds of things that I think we lost the most. Jim?
We did have 2 bicycles stolen.
Oh, yes, that's right. It's from the top of our car because we were so excited about friends being there, we forgot to lock them. So 2 disappeared, 1 reappeared, the big one that was John Carlson's. Yep,
I've heard from a fairly reliable source,
fairly.
or maybe 2 of them, that there were some funny things that happened along the way. You want to share 1 or 2 of your most humorous experiences with your colleagues?
Okay, well, give me a clue. What were you thinking of particularly?
Well, I heard that Jim has an awful lot of wind behind him.
Oh, yes, that one. Jim is a very competitive man, and it was quite windy one day when we were biking across, mainly on Highway 2 in the center of Nebraska, biking from west to east. And this breeze came up, and he had his yellow jacket on, and he said, "I've always wondered how far I could ride without pedaling." And so he decided, the wind was strong enough that day, that's exactly what he would do. And so he, unzipped his jacket and kind of billowed it out, and he caught the wind. And it was hilly, and the rest of us were taking pedal strokes, very wisely. But Jim was going to do this. He was going to bike as far as he could. And so you could hear him kind of, oh, yeah, oh, no. And we'd say, oh, he's not going to make it over that hill. And he'd make it over that hill. And sometimes he kind of bounced it just a little bit to get that extra movement. And finally, 13 some miles later, we were coming into Broken Bow. And I've always thought, well, he didn't have any broken bones in Broken Bow. But then he got going, but he had been in one position for so long. He hadn't rotated his legs at all. And he said, "How do I stop?" And we said, well, don't count on us. We're not going to get in front of you and stop you. He said, there's a rise right here. Go up there, and you'll have to get off on your own because we are not going to sacrifice ourselves for you to stop. So he eventually was able to get off, and he hobbled off that bike and walked in rather strange way for a little while until he managed to say, I have to look. It was 13.38, he remembers, miles that he had been blown by the wind. So that took a lot of competitiveness, not I.
How did you choose your route? How did you decide where to go from where you were? Did you follow blue highways, or how did you choose it?
Yeah, mostly blue highways, though there were times, particularly in the Southwest, where we had to go on the interstate because there were no frontage roads. But there it was labeled that you could do that. But Jim was the chief map maker and so forth. Depending upon the number of days we had, where if there was something that we specifically wanted to see, what scenic area or whatever, he would try to choose a route that would accommodate us. And of course, for spring break rides, it would be much more limited. But we used as many low traffic count days highways as we possibly could. And we used to get maps. This was in the days when you had to write and order the maps and get the traffic count on the highways. But mostly it was blue highways. I remember driving to with our bicycles, and I was alone, to Oregon, to Oregon, and I was listening to the book, Blue Highways, and I said, that's what we do. We go on the blue highways. And also it depends upon if there are towns where we can stay, because we were not camping. And so we needed to have motels. some of which were not appropriate for anybody.
So, did you do RAGBRAI at all, or any others that were group kinds of
Yes.
rides?
Yeah, we completed, I think it was 5 RAGBRAIs. We did every other year. When our first cross-state ride was RAGBRAI, and that was what kind of cinched it for us. And then, so we did that every other year for 4, and then we rode one more complete one and several partials. So, but it was wonderful. It's a wonderful festival.
Then, were there any other ones like that?
No, we did shorter rides in Iowa and Wisconsin and so forth, but no other cross-state rides. We looked at them, but then we decided we much preferred having our own plans. But RAGBRAI was special.
I just want to say I was very impressed by Jim's planning. We went with you guys
Yes.
across Georgia.
Yes.
And I distinctly remember there was like, it looked like a shack on the side of a dirt road in the trees. And he announces this is lunch.
That's right. And it was good.
You gotta be kidding me. I walk up to the counter and the guy is inside the shack fixing chicken. And it was good.
Yes.
And we weren't the only ones that knew about it. Trucks arrived from all over the place at lunchtime. They knew about it. How the heck he found out about it, I have no idea.
I don't know either. He had that magic, I guess. He wasn't always entirely successful, but he was more successful than the rest of us would have been, that's for sure.
Were you guys really lost from the excerpt that you read in the book? Did you ever find Highway 27?
Yes, we did. Jim's instincts were perfect, and we went the way he wanted to go, and then got onto a highway, and by this time it was getting quite dark, and there was sleet, and the potholes on the side of the road were really quite treacherous. But we made it to a motel, and then Jim called our B&B and said, we can't make it because of the weather, and the man said, I understand, and I won't charge you. So, yes, Jim was absolutely right. Okay, well, thank you so very, very much. You've been delightful, and I appreciate it. Now, if you are at all interested, we do have books, which I'd be happy to sign if you want. And Steve is going to be somewhere. Well, okay, yes. And the books are $25, and you can pay with cash, credit card, check, IOU, you owe him. And if you are buying it by any chance for somebody else, we've got slips of paper that Sandy will be happy to give you. Write the name of the person, and also if you want one for yourself, write your name, or if you want a special message of any kind, just feel free to do that. And so thank you so much for being here, and we appreciate it very, very much. Thank you.